with Dr. Richard Johnson, a senior lecturer in US politics and policy at Queen Mary University of London. And thank you for joining me this morning. The first point I think that we have to explore is to what extent is the legacy of Boris Johnson, and indeed the brief legacy of Liz Truss, now being torn up by this new government. Boris Johnson made a big play in his final speech to Parliament behind that dispatch box, saying that we need to make those long-term investment decisions, we needed to set aside what he called treasury mindset, and we needed to invest in things like new nuclear. Now it looks like that might well be abandoned.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the last election in a bit of a larger historical context, the Conservatives only have won a sizable majority once in over 35 years, really. You have to go back to 1987 with Thatcher. Of course, they won the 92 election and they won in 2015, but they were pretty small majorities. The Johnson achievement was to create a kind of new coalition of Conservative voters, to put the Conservatives' tanks on Labour's lawn in the Midlands and North, and that required a different set of policy priorities for the party. We are still in that parliament. I know it doesn't feel like it, but we are still in the parliament that was elected on the 2019 mandate. And really, between Truss and now Sunak, the Conservative government seems to be forgetting the mandate on which it was elected. And governments that forget the mandate that put them in office often risk a backlash from those voters when they meet them again at the next general election.
December 2019 does feel like a complete world away. It was a time before COVID. It was a time when Brexit was on the forefront of everyone's lips as the predominant issue. I wonder, to what extent can politicians perhaps be forgiven for thinking that that it wasn't only 2.5 years ago, that it was in fact a lot longer ago?
Yeah, of course, governments can say that the circumstances change and the manifesto commitments they make have to be seen in the light of those circumstances. But that's about adjusting priorities in light of those challenges. It's not about adopting a completely different set of priorities. I mean, it seems to me that what Rishi Sunak might be intending to do is to try to bring back more of the kind of David Cameron, George Osborne approach to Conservative governance. And the problem with that is that, it didn't actually achieve a huge majority for the Conservatives in 2015. It didn't win them a majority at all in 2010. And that the group of voters that helped them win that small majority in 2015, voters like in places like in Oxford West, which amazingly, once upon a time, not that long ago, had a Conservative MP, they're not coming back. So it's because of Brexit and the kind of social changes that have occurred. So I think it's a flawed strategy to think that, you can kind of go pre-Boris in terms of policy priorities and think that you're going to produce Boris Johnson-sized majorities the next election.
And it's interesting, looking particularly at the context in which we find ourselves now, the energy crisis in particular, the idea that a nuclear power station might be abandoned as something that is being invested in seems like an incredibly short-termist decision. It reminded me this morning of a clip of Nick Clegg, the former leader of the Lib Dems, of course, that became very, very famous on social media not that long ago. Here's what Nick Clegg had to say about nuclear power investment back in 2010.
The most optimistic scenarios from the government itself, there's no way they're going to have new nuclear come on stream until about 2021, 2022. So it's just not even an answer.
Not delivering new nuclear power stations back in 2010 because they wouldn't come on stream until 2021, 2022. Are we at risk of our politicians falling into that same trap now again?
Yes, I mean, there are many ills that Nick Clegg inflicted on this country while he was in government. That's clearly one of the clangers. This is a government that talks about being pro-growth. Well, you don't have growth without investment, and investment can come from the private sector, sure, but you also need government to play its role in investment, and government needs to play its role in investment in the kinds of things that government does best, which is ensuring that we have the correct kind of energy infrastructure, that we have the correct kind of transport infrastructure, right? And if governments don't do that, the private sector is not going to necessarily fill the gap, and that we as a country will be paying the costs of that in lost growth for years and years to come. It's a much, in my view, it's a much bigger travesty, actually, and actually much bigger damage to growth than, say, whatever the GDP consequences of leaving the European single market were. Right? I think that these kinds of things are about how our own internal economy functions, and if we're not putting the investment behind that, then we're going to suffer for years to come.
So really, really interesting and profound choices that the government has to make in the next, week and a half now. Let's hope that they take on board some of those arguments, and particularly about crucial, critical national energy infrastructure. You'd think now, of all times, the government wouldn't be abandoning that sort of investment. Well, for now, Richard Johnson, thank you so much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Really